Hello and welcome to the Points to Ponder for Chapter 5. For this chapter I'm going to be talking about 3 points. Obviously there's a lot of material in this chapter worth discussing, but in the time that we have there are 3 ideas that I really want to focus on. The first deals with what your authors call Domain 1, Normative Ethics, and this starts on page 124, and their focus is on what we should do. And they talk first about virtue ethics, which is this notion of being virtuous. And as I read this material, I thought, the question that we should all be asking ourselves is, how is it exactly that a person learns to be virtuous? As you look at those of us in this class, what do we do as parents, as teachers, as adult role models, as members of society to teach our children to be honest, prudent, wise, kind? How are we encouraging them? And then to build on that, as people grow into adulthood and they go into the workforce, what can a leader do to encourage people to be virtuous? I think one of the answers to this question lies in reinforcement theory. And reinforcement theory says that when we want people to repeat certain behaviors, we need to reward those behaviors. And when we want people to not engage in particular behaviors, we have to either extinguish or punish those behaviors. When we reward people, we're really doing that in 2 different ways. One is positive reinforcement, where we give something positive in exchange for that person's good behavior. Negative reinforcement is when we take away something bad in exchange for that person's good behavior. Negative reinforcement is not punishment. Punishment is when you administer something bad in exchange for a person's bad behavior. The last part of all of this is extinction, where basically you look to figure out if a person is engaging in inappropriate behavior, what's supporting that behavior, and then you try and take that support away. Well, if we want children to grow up to be kind, to be honest, then we need to reward them when they're honest, right? And we need to take away the incentive for them to not be honest with us, to not be kind. So there's a lot we can learn from reinforcement theory. Now, in organizations, what we find, you might be thinking to yourself, well, don't we do that? I mean, we would expect people to be pretty virtuous. We do reward for honesty. Well, think carefully about what you've observed in the workplace and if this is true. I have a great article that I'm attaching to go along with this video on our front news page that's written by Stephen Kerr, and it's called On the Folly of Rewarding A While Hoping for B. And it's a classic article in which Kerr talks about how we say we want one thing, but then we turn around and we reward something else. It's a very easy read, and I want to encourage you to do so. Now, a quick overview of 3 different kinds of virtues. There are the ones that are on the inside. This is courage and self-control. Those on the outside, directed outwardly. Those are generosity, magnificence, sociability. And then the third category is toward fairness, so the notion of justice. All right, so that's all virtue ethics. The second is deontology, and here what we're doing is we're following a higher set of rules and duties. And probably the classic is the stuff by Immanuel Kant, and he talks about his imperatives. So the Kantian imperatives, for example, universal law and the golden rule. A question I have for you, everybody says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But what if a person is morally corrupt? And they really don't care how other people treat them. They really don't care about other people. Then I'm not sure we want that person using the golden rule in order to make ethical decisions. There are some bigger issues there. A second way of thinking about the imperatives is non-instrumentalization, or the end itself. And here what Kant is saying is, treat people as an end in themselves, worthy of respect. Don't just treat them as a means to an end. Great example of this. I was in my organizational behavior class talking about the importance of satisfaction, that this is something we study and we want to understand better. And I said to the class, why? Why do we want to better understand satisfaction? And almost every single answer that came back was one in which it was clear they were thinking about people as a means. For example, We care about satisfaction because it helps to ensure that they'll perform at a higher level. We care about satisfaction because it helps to ensure that they won't quit. We care about satisfaction because it helps to ensure that they won't engage in deviant behavior. See what all of these have in common? In every case, we're only caring about satisfaction because it leads to some other end. My argument is that we should care about satisfaction because people in and of themselves, period, deserve to be treated with respect. They deserve to be satisfied in the workforce. Oh, and by the way, in case you're wondering, the research on the relationship between satisfaction and performance says that making somebody satisfied actually doesn't make them perform at a higher level. That theory is akin to an old wives' tale. It's a tacit theory that's not borne out by the actual data. Instead, it's turned around. When people perform at a high level, they tend to be pretty satisfied. So it doesn't do any good, if you're going for more performance, it doesn't do any good, hey, to just focus on trying to make people happy. Instead, if you want to make people happy, you should just do it because you believe they deserve to be happy. Third is this notion of the kingdom of ends, which is society. That's just another way of saying that. And basically the idea is that any maxim that we would want applied to ourselves has to be acceptable for every other rational being. And the classic way of thinking about this is, would you be okay with whatever you're thinking about doing being publicized in the paper? The last under this first point is consequentialism, which is judging by the outcome. This is a teleological approach, which comes from telos, which means end in Greek. Basically, this one is rooted in hedonism, and it says the good decision, the moral decision, is the one that maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain. I'll bet without me even prompting you, you can think of several potential issues associated with that approach. Right off the bat, whose pleasure? Whose pain? Utilitarianism is the most classic version of this, and they talk about maximizing benefits for the greatest number of people. But this can potentially lead to a tyranny of the majority, in which the needs and interests of the minority, the folks in the minority, are disregarded because basically majority rules. That's a serious issue with consequentialism. Okay, that's it for point one. Point two. Talks about descriptive ethics. This is on page 131. And here you get a pretty straightforward ethical decision-making and action model. Here's how it goes. It's a person-situation interaction. So the person becomes aware that there's an ethical dilemma. That person makes a judgment, a determination of what he or she thinks is right. The person then is motivated to behave in the right direction. Then finally, behavior is the actual action. Now, what is it that influences each of these steps, awareness, judgment, motivation, and behavior? Well, there are individual factors, and for that you want to see figure 5.1.2. For example, gender makes a difference as a demographic factor. Locus of control makes a difference as a psychological factor. Locus of control, very quickly, is basically the extent to which you believe you are the master of your own fate. People with an internal locus of control believe that they control what happens to them. People with an external locus of control believe that it doesn't matter what they do, no matter the effort they exert, fate just happens. Situational factors, so that was individual factors. And then there are situational factors that dictate the extent to which a person and how a person becomes aware, makes a judgment, is motivated, and behaves. Here you want to look at figure 5.1.3, and we're talking about categories like issue-related. A good example is moral intensity, and then other kinds of context-related factors like rewards. You know, if you're in an organizational system where you're rewarded for behaving in certain ways, odds are good, as a human being, you're going to go ahead and behave in those expected and rewarded ways. All right, point 3, the last one, talks about ethics management. So we're building up, okay, we're building up. Getting larger, getting more organizational. And I think probably the most interesting part of this component of this chapter is where the authors take Kohlberg's work on individuals' cognitive moral development and they extend that to the organizational perspective. And for this I'd ask you to look at page 138 and it's figure 5.1.6. And so on the left, you see Kohlberg's work. We have people who are in the pre-conventional phase. They tend to do things because they're obedient, they're trying to avoid being punished, or two, they're expecting some straightforward reward. That's the instrumentality and exchange. Then there's conventional, which is where most adults are, where we conform because that's the right thing to do. We are fulfilling other people's expectations, and we're living within society and the systems that society has established. At the highest level, the principled level, here's where people do things because it's the right thing to do, where I have, as a human being who lives a life of privilege, I am obligated and I have a responsibility to behave in ethical ways. Okay, so that's Kohlberg's work. Over on the right in this figure is where you see the analogy to the organization. And so you have on the bottom, going from the bottom, unbalanced, all the way up to balanced, from amoral, which is, I don't see situations as having an ethical component, to legalistic, where we will do whatever the law requires us to do, no more, no less, to responsive, we're going to be more proactive, even if there isn't a law on the books that tells us we should be behaving in a certain way. We're going to do it maybe because of our stakeholder management plan, where we've decided, building from a previous chapter, where we've decided that we need to treat our stakeholders in particular ways. Then you've got emerging ethical and ethical, where now we're really thinking about our impact on the greater system, the greater society. All right, the rest of the chapter gives you a lot of interesting detail and ideas about what organizations both can and should do. Here's the bottom line. There really does appear to be a positive correlation between intentional organizational behavior, okay, what the organization does, and subsequent ethical behavior. So basically, when we have codes of conduct in place, when we have a structure that encourages ethical behavior, when we have rewards and systems that, again, facilitate that ethical behavior, guess what? That ethical behavior happens. So the true bottom line, triple bottom line, the ROI in virtually all cases is in fact positive. It's worth paying attention to ethics.